Most of us have gone through a breakup at some point in our lives. And while relationships are intrinsic to human nature, they're not easy to navigate through all the time, especially when you can sense the end might be near. It's not easy to admit when it reaches a boiling point, but there are a lot of feelings from both parties that you have to sift through, and all the good times and memories you made together doesn't make it any easier. And it sucks even more when an otherwise great relationship is followed by a bad breakup. In the NBA, we've seen parallels to this far too often, as players with notable or legendary tenures on specific teams go out in the worst way. But it's almost inevitable when you mix winning, losing, business, and the human condition. And while some can work through it and it's all good in the end, for others, it can take a sour turn and end on bad terms. My name is Caleb, and the most recent NBA trade deadline had me thinking about how certain star players end their tenures with certain teams in ways that really put a damper on the time they spent there. Not to say that it takes away from whatever they were able to accomplish in the years they spent on that team, but as I thought about it, it happens a bit more often than we might think. These situations can be so unique and different depending on the circumstances, and whether it's on the player, the team, or a mixture of both parties having a hand in the breakup, it never fails to at least be entertaining. So today, I want to talk about when players with notable legacies on certain teams end on bad terms, and some of the reasons it tends to happen. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. No matter how cliche you think it is, getting the "it's not you, it's me" speech is very real, and therapy has made me realize that I have been on both sides of that fence. But some people are way more honest and blunt when it comes to that statement, and will straight up tell you that you are in fact the reason that the relationship isn't working. In basketball, we've seen this sentiment in notable tenures throughout NBA history where superstars who feel like their teams weren't doing enough to help them win. If you're around my age, the decision was one of the first things we had seen in sports that made you question player-team loyalty and whether waiting around to win was worth it. LeBron never said it publicly during his first tenure in Cleveland, but it was an open secret that he was tired of receiving relatively lackluster help on the Cavs during his 7 years there. Rumors and countless jersey swaps throughout the 2010 season got the ball rolling on this narrative, but player loyalty was still very much celebrated at that time. You stay until you win, and if you don't, oh well. So when LeBron chose to leave Cleveland for Miami that offseason, Cavs owner Dan Gilbert responded in a way that we had never really seen before, mocking his nickname and proclaiming that the Cavs would win a chip before LeBron ever would, but I'm not sure anyone actually believed that. All would end well and LeBron would come back and make it up to the fans before another exit a couple years later, this time a lot more amicable. It doesn't have to always end ugly, but time heals all wounds. Most of the time. I'm not sure if OKC fans have ever fully forgiven KD for leaving back in 2016, but what I do know is that at the time, it gave us the most obvious script in the NBA for the next few years. Barring injury, there was no way anyone was beating Golden State in a 7-game series despite everyone outside of the Bay desperately wanting to see them fail. As NBA Twitter began to explode around that time, everyone's opinion on the move was more amplified than ever, even the faceless accounts you would otherwise never think about, until you looked a little more closely to see that some of those faceless accounts weren't very faceless at all. In fact, was a future Hall of Famer shooting off his displeasures at his old team and teammates accidentally from his own account instead of his alleged burners. The bad blood between KD and the OKC organization was publicized from that moment forward, but even after being there through the move from Seattle, multiple conference finals appearances, and even a trip to the biggest stage in 2012, all of that, at least for the moment, seemed like it didn't even matter. Usually when your best player in franchise history leaves, you hold their number until it's time to hang it in the rafters one day. But apparently in 2017, no number was off limits and the iconic number 35 Thunder jersey was given to undrafted rookie PJ Dozier just a year after KD left, a number he'd wear throughout the entire 2018 season. While KD and OKC's bad terms have seemingly yet to be resolved, there's maybe hope for them one day to come back together and make things right. Players making it known that in their eyes, a team is in the wrong is not a new concept in the slightest and can be traced back decades. But for a player of Shaq's caliber, he may be the most notable star where he made it known that he was not going to move forward in multiple places in his career. Granted, you can give him a pass on his Orlando exit. They were being relatively cheap when it came to retaining one of the most dominant players in the league at the time, so like many superstars, he made his way to LA. But after a 3-peat and another finals appearance on top of that, the Hollywood relationship had soured. Not to mention one of the most infamous basketball feuds of all time between him and Kobe, Shaq's letdown performance in the 2004 finals along with salary cap restrictions led him to demanding a trade. GM Mitch Kupchak were maybe some of his biggest critics at the time. He essentially told LA it was either Kobe or him, and with that in mind, He was promptly shipped to Miami, which would see him win another championship, but also end on pretty bad terms. According to Shaq, he thought that Pat Riley didn't believe that he was suffering from injuries, which escalated to a near physical altercation at practice in February of '08. While Shaq has made amends with the teams that he ended on pretty bad terms with, praising the people that he once had beef with, taking accountability for his actions, and having his numbers retired on the teams he made a name for himself with, players being blunt on wanting out is never not a messy situation. The same can be said for the opposite. What about when it's the team who forces a player out? It is less often, but when it does happen, it typically comes as a surprise. Usually when it's the player who initiates the breakup, you can see its gradual buildup and you can see it on the horizon. But when a team does it, especially when it comes to their best player, it can be a head scratcher sometimes. Maybe the most confusing move like this ever made the NBA world stand still just after midnight on February 2nd, 2025. What team in their right mind would trade away a 25-year-old perennial All-NBA selection on a Hall of Fame trajectory, fresh off a finals appearance and just entering their prime? The Mavs apparently, because they wanted to move on without Luka ever hinting that he wanted to leave Dallas. If anything, he was going to be there for the long haul, as he reportedly had just bought a new house in Dallas literally a few weeks before being traded. But surprisingly to literally anyone who pays attention to the NBA, the Mavs didn't see Luka as a fixture in their long-term future, with alleged weight concerns and work ethic being at the forefront. Not to mention they were going to avoid paying him a 5-year, $346 million supermax that he was going to be eligible for this summer. The Mavs GM Nico Harrison quickly became one of the most infamous GM in sports for this trade alone, as he's had to defend himself for both the trade and from backlash from Mavs fans everywhere. Do you know how wild a trade is that your prospective trade partner, Lakers GM Rob Pelinka in this case, thought it was some sort of joke? Maybe the most insane trade in NBA history was discussed at a local Dallas coffee shop, and Dallas officially got rid of one of the faces of the league. The Luka for AD trade may go down as one of the most blatant snuffs from a team towards a player that seemingly had no problems with each other beforehand. Mostly everything seemed good from the outside, but you never truly know what goes down in an NBA front office. I mean, you could come off a season where you finish top 5 in MVP voting, make second team All-NBA, and play through injury as much as possible, but in the league, if you're an asset, you're an asset. Isaiah Thomas's injury report at the time was something debated by fans, media, and even the Celtics themselves, as no one outside of the organization truly knew how severe IT's injury was at the time. And to add to the mix, Kyrie Irving wanted out of Cleveland, wanting to be the #1 option on a contender. Boston was already halfway there, and wanting Irving, it meant that IT was more than likely the centerpiece of the deal. Isaiah Thomas found out how fast you can go from superstar to trade asset after suddenly being traded for Kyrie back during the 2017 offseason. We even got to see the emotional process documented from him, and as fun as watching Isaiah Thomas play in Boston was for those 2.5 years, it was still hard to see him in another uniform after that, especially so suddenly. And the fact that he ended up becoming a career journeyman after never fully recovering from that hip injury just shows that in hindsight, it ended up working out for Boston in the long run, but I'm sure that most of us hope that it worked out for IT too. And sometimes a team wanting to move on from you is a bit more subtle and drawn out. Unlike a situation like Luka's or IT's where it's a lot more sudden and a surprise, a situation like Damian Lillard's in Portland is maybe one of the most unique of the last decade. Near the end of his tenure in Portland, and amidst all the roster overhauls and playoff shortcomings, Dame was committed to Portland for as long as he possibly could, going as far as saying his winning a championship would be nice, but also took a dig at ring culture, saying that a ringless resume shouldn't diminish what other accomplishments and achievements a player has gotten in their career. Dame was ultimately fine with whatever direction Portland was going in, but the Blazers were seemingly headed in one that didn't include him. Wanting to go younger and focus on the development of players like Anthony Simons and drafting Scoot Henderson to be the point guard of the future, it was at that point he knew what direction they were going in. Lillard would request a trade during the 2023 offseason, seeing the writing on the wall. Blazers GM Joe Cronin reiterated after Dame's trade request that the Blazers would love for Dame to stay, but the goals for the team remain the same. We're past any era where players are truly celebrated for being loyal to their teams, and the combination of the Blazers wanting to go younger, NBA media claiming Dame didn't care about winning, and a handful of other factors ultimately led to the trade request. The Blazers were essentially in a separation with Dame. They hadn't quite broken up, but they were in different places, as that's what it seemed like the team wanted. Dame would be traded to the Bucks during the 2023 offseason for a better chance at winning a ring, but his breakup with the Blazers seemed more one-sided from the team itself, but that's just my perspective. I'm curious to hear yours in the comments. The Dame and Blazers split kind of eases into that territory where both the players and team butt heads about what direction they should go in and whether or not they can move forward. In my opinion, these situations end up the most ugly and most drawn out. And we have plenty of recent and more extreme examples of this, with the most recent being Jimmy Butler versus the Miami Heat. As with a lot of disputes in sports and life for regular folks like you and I, financial disagreements can go south quickly. Jimmy Butler and Heat president Pat Riley used to be close. Their intense basketball personalities went hand in hand, and Jimmy was a perfect fit for the famous Heat culture. After D-Wade retired in 2019, Jimmy was given the keys to the organization and followed it with 3 All-NBA selections, 2 All-Star selections, and led Miami to 2 of the most unlikely runs to the finals this decade. Despite not getting over the hump and winning a championship, you could argue that Butler's Heat tenure was only behind Wade and LeBron's as the best in franchise history. Surely the number 22 Heat jersey was going to be hanging in the rafters one day, but now I'm thinking it might take a little longer than expected. As Jimmy Butler was set to potentially become a free agent in 2025 with his player option, it was time for him and Pat Riley to sit down and talk about extensions. And no, not those. Butler was going to be 36 before the start of the 2025-26 season, and a long-term max for a player that old can be questionable depending on who it is, but after all that Jimmy had done in Miami, most franchises would probably go ahead and give him what he felt that he deserved. But the Miami Heat aren't most franchises. Similarly, back in 2016, Dwayne Wade, the greatest player in franchise history, expected a deal similar to Butler's, but was only offered a 2-year extension for $31 million. Feeling disrespected, he'd leave for Chicago that offseason. And while Wade's departure wasn't as loud publicly, Butler's situation brought forth another instance of Pat Riley versus a Miami Heat star. Seeds were planted early during the 2024 playoffs as Riley would publicly condemn some of Butler's antics, going as far as telling him to keep his mouth shut after Jimmy claimed they would have beaten the eventual champion Celtics if he were playing. Butler was reportedly stunned by this, causing them to not be on speaking terms for months after. Come January 2025, Butler requested a trade from Miami. Before a 6-game road trip earlier this year, Miami suspended Jimmy for conduct detrimental to the team, as it was clear he was over Miami, but at that point, it was carrying over to his teammates and coaches. One of the most beloved teammates in the league was now becoming unwelcomed by his teammates for reportedly going through the motions and not playing to win. After Butler privately met with Riley and team owner Mickey Arison, he reiterated his trade request. He was again suspended 2 more games after missing a team flight to Milwaukee, and at that point, the writing was on the wall. The final nail in the coffin on the Butler and Heat love affair was on January 27th of this year, after Jimmy walked out of shoot-around after learning that Haywood Highsmith would be starting over him, and he was suspended indefinitely. The Jimmy Butler Heat saga would end at the 2025 trade deadline after he was traded to the Warriors, a trade that probably would have headlined most other years. Most of these situations where each the player and the team take shots at each other a bit more loudly than if it was just one or the other will more than likely end in a trade. Remember the way James Harden and the Rockets tenure ended? It's one of those bigger trades that may be lost to time because it was right after the NBA bubble, and Harden did briefly play for Houston that year before being traded to the Nets in January 2021. But so many affiliated with the Rockets, including players, coaches, and team execs, felt that Harden was calling all the shots in Houston. He was accused of flying to different cities frequently before and after games, leading a culture deemed as casual, having fans and the organization alike question his commitment. But the Rockets allegedly just allowed this type of culture to take shape. According to an anonymous team source, the team bus would be late, the team plane wouldn't take off on time. It was almost like a professional AAU team. James Harden's tenure in Houston saw one of the greatest peaks a shooting guard has ever had in league history, including an MVP and an argument to be made that he maybe should have won a couple more. But they only made 2 Western Conference Finals appearances to show for it. One of the worst ways to go out after a truly prolific tenure there. There are a handful of other examples of teams and players actively contributing to their breakup simultaneously, but every NBA relationship ends one way or another. We didn't even get to players who somehow stayed on the same team throughout their entire careers, other players who blatantly quit on their teams, or even some of the players we talked about today who went through multiple instances of ending on bad terms with their former teams. Let me know in the comments who you think are some of the most notable player tenures that ended fairly ugly, and if you think some of those bridges burned can be repaired at some point if they haven't already. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.